How's everyone doing tonight? Hey, feeling good? So it's a little warm in here. The mic's a little brassy. You've been at it now for quite a while, but let's bring the energy level up, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm about to bring some very special people up onto the stage. So with us for the next hour, as I understand it, I've not been informed of any pseudonyms. I've not been informed of any tricky maneuvers I should make in this introduction, so the introduction is going to be straight. I'm introducing Joanna Fiduccia and Catherine Hansen. Joanna to Catherine's left, so Joanna farthest from me here at the podium, and Catherine closer. Joanna teaches art history at Reed College and has a distinguished career as a critic and journalist, on top of previous makerly lives in at least 2 media that I know of, and has at times also presented with Estar Sayre. Catherine Hansen, who is laureated with a doctorate in comparative literature, with the somewhat unusual conjunction of languages, Romanian and Japanese. So it's a narrow, the Venn diagrams of interdisciplinarity but it turns out that Surrealism lets you travel, and she travels as a Surrealist across these linguistic and disciplinary realms. Catherine Hansen teaches at the University of Tokyo, and has also put in some significant time as an Estar Sayrean over the years, in addition to many other gifts and charms. She's actually bilocated, as many of you will know, in Tokyo and Beirut, so it's a heck of a commute. She actually lives in Beirut and teaches in Tokyo. But I'll let her explain that. Without further ado, Catherine Hansen and Joanna Fiduccia.
Thanks very much, Graham. So hello, we're very, very happy to be with you this evening. As you now know, I'm Catherine, that's Joanna, and we're going to talk to you this evening about Surrealist practices of attention and practices of Surrealist attention. The characters at the center of these studies will be the same. The group of writers and artists in interwar France who gathered around a charismatic and complex impresario, André Breton. In manifestos and exhibitions, but principally through actions and exertions of the imagination, the Surrealists sought the wholesale liberation of the individual from the degrading, dehumanizing effects of modern life. They believed they could achieve this revolutionary aim by demolishing the artificial barriers that separate our psychic lives from our everyday existence. And attention, we both will argue, was one of their principal tools for dismantling rationalism's edifice and for building a bridge, one marvelous causeway between the collective unconscious and social life. Surrealist attention is therefore our topic, and each of us has chosen her own specific aspect of it to discuss with you. I will be speaking second on the programmatic misapplication of attention in Surrealism. But first we'll be hearing from Joanna, whose interests lie with the inverse of this phenomenon, the Surrealist programmatic application of inattention. It bears saying that this phrase, the Surrealist application of inattention, appears paradoxical, even nonsensical. For the whole idea of applying something programmatically, willfully, seems to cancel out any state of distraction that might have been there at the start. At the very least, applying our inattention suggests a splitting of the self into its willful and absent-minded regions. But what Joanna will argue this evening is that Surrealism was invested in making particular use of our states of distraction to establish not absent-mindedness, but co-presence with things in the world. When we were considering how we might go about presenting this topic of surrealist attention, Joanna mentioned a moment in the history of surrealism when a kind of theophany of the modern spirit occurred at the intersection of attention and distraction. That moment was the publication of some photographs by Brassai, captioned by Salvador Dali, in the 1933 issue of the art review Inventor. She will speak more about this later. But by way of introduction, why don't I just show you the page now? So what you see here are 6 uncredited photographs, each accompanied by a short descriptive caption, and all grouped under the title Involuntary Sculptures. Art historians talk about it as both a photo essay in its limit state and a peculiar collaborative artwork that, by combining photography and writing, produces a third medium, sculpture. The photographs are all close-ups of the flotsam of daily life. We see a couple of rolled-up bus tickets, a bread roll, a piece of soap, and is that toothpaste?
That's toothpaste. In fact, what it is
toothpaste, and so on. The combination of Brassai's dramatic use of chiaroscuro and the close-up itself makes them assume monumental proportions. Most of them also appear to levitate because Brassai very cannily photographed them on thin panes of glass, like natural specimens prepared for a microscope. The captions, meanwhile, refer them alternately to an aesthetic typology, a so-called modern style, and to a social pathology. One of the tickets has been palpated by a, quote, middling bureaucrat from a local bank. Another piece of paper was rolled into a neat cigarillo, we're told, by a mentally impaired individual, and so on. Scholars like Joanna are interested in this work because it straddles 2 major strands of the surrealist relationship to the object and, in a sense, to the objective world at large. I'll just go over this part again quickly while we're on the subject.
Okay, I'll pick up when you're done.
So yes, as Joanna will tell us, 2 strands. Actually, I think the better word would be orientations. Those 2 orientations are finding and educing. As I mentioned very briefly at the start of this talk, your talk, the Surrealists were interested in deploying a series of techniques from merging conscious and unconscious states on the principle that these had been artificially separated in modernity to serve capitalist ends. By reinstating their unity, the Surrealists believe they could bring about the liberation of the individual and the collective spirit, and that political and economic emancipation would follow from that liberation. Joanna's paper begins by going over 2 key Surrealist activities for defeating this artificial quarantine of dream life from daily life, the quest for the found object, and the work of psychic automatism. In the former, the Surrealists transformed the figure of the 19th century flaneur, the person who wandered the city freely, taking in the entirety of its spectacle, into an attuned individual who would be, periodically and powerfully, interpolated by specific objects in it. Do you have some images of these found objects?
If you just advance one more.
Right. Here we go. So we have a lady's glove, an inscrutable half mask, a strange spoon. These are just some canonical examples. Surrealists called them found objects, but actually Breton described the architecture of the experience as though it were the objects that did the finding. You wandered around with a particular concern, a half-submerged desire, a niggling problem, and if you were sufficiently open, objects presented themselves as the solution. Their obscured history coincided with your unarticulated desire, and this convergence is called the encounter. The flea market was a particularly propitious site for these encounters, both because it was full of outmoded, inscrutable stuff, and because it facilitated an abstracted or unfocused errance on behalf of the visitor. Educing, Joanna will then go on to say, suggests a reciprocal movement, one where instead of an object hauled up from the depths of the psyche, it is our hauling up from the depths of the psyche, our unconscious state. It is our unconscious that impresses itself upon the world. So the Surrealists generated a set of techniques from trances to, I thought I was going to talk about this part, is that right?
I just figured I would mention it first. You know, I would mention it.
Right. Let's just say for now that Surrealists generated techniques to bypass the rational mind, such as trances, games that interrupted your train of thought, techniques that required giving up some control to the materials, and the...
Sorry, there's a slide.
A slide? Art historians and their slides, am I right? Anyway, all this to achieve so-called psychic automatism. This is actually how André Breton defined Surrealism in the first manifesto in 1924 as psychic automatism in its pure state. One of the objections that people have made about this characterization is that pure automatism, understood as the total surrender of control or intention, seems both an impossible feat and an inaccurate description of the Surrealist works that actually emerge in its first decades. If you are still writing words in grammatical sentences, if you are still producing figurative representations, however fragmented, how can you say that you are enacting pure automatism? Well, what Joanna will soon tell us in her talk is she will show how we can frame Surrealist automatism in a longer history of dynamic psychiatry, dating from the late 19th century, in which kindred techniques of automatic eduction were used in therapeutic capacities. Importantly, these techniques generated automatism not through the surrender of control, but through distraction. Prominent figures in that period, Pierre Janet, William James, Frederick Meyer, determined that in order to access repressed memories, one needed to circumvent behavioral conventions. Okay, so basically they devised activities that shared the premise that one needed to distract the patient, one needed to train her conscious attention on something else for long enough that the repressed content could emerge through another channel that had, in the meantime, been allowed to flow unmonitored. So, freedom of expression, and eventually freedom from repression, is achieved with the aid of distraction. To get at the slag heap of memory, which is actually not so different from the endless piles of stuff in the flea market, right? Right. To get at this material, one needs to occupy that part of the mind whose principal job it is to police the boundary between the present and the past. One should mention that this model has consequences for how expression itself is conceived, not as the application of individual creativity to some medium, but instead as something that percolates up from a reservoir of habits and seemingly inoperative recollections. We can think back to Dali's captions in the involuntary sculptures that describe these forms as manifestations of modern style, as though the modernity of the style were precisely its unwilled nature, its curious impersonality. There's some notes here. Oh, you have a quote, okay. Boredom. Boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. That's Walter Benjamin. According to Pierre Janet, we're constantly experimenting with a state of expressive distraction. We breach the reality principle when we daydream, or fiddle with something, or chatter idly. Benjamin, oh, now I understand why you're quoting him here. Okay, so Benjamin begins to articulate how in the early 20th century, those absent-minded actions get incorporated into the medium that is seemingly most covetous of our attention, namely film. Another slide cue here. Is it this one? Okay. The distracted person, too, can form habits, he writes. More. The ability to master certain tasks in a state of distraction proves that their solution has become a matter of habit. Distraction, as provided by art, presents a covert control of the extent to which new tasks have become soluble by apperception. Reception in a state of distraction finds in film its true mode of exercise. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. This passage, with which many of you will be all too familiar, is from Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproducibility, and it does present an interesting complication to the natural and even therapeutic uses of distraction evoked above. It reminds us that the same channel opened by distraction for expression can be used for reception, for taking in something only too eager to take advantage of our relatively defenseless state, distracted, in this case, by the stream of images in film montage. Okay, so you've written here, Surrealism's relation to abstraction must be viewed as a dialectic of this mass cultural tactic and dynamic psychiatry's therapeutic ends. For if the subject for surrealism is this distractible 20th century figure, and more specifically, if the people whose hands crafted the objects in Brassai's photos are members of a general urban population, depersonalized either by their place in the bureaucracy or by their marginality, the surrealists... What?
Just a slide.
Right. Yes, the surrealists nevertheless want to preserve a space for thought's production, for something to come out and encounter others in the world. I'm guessing by this slide, this is where you're going to talk about sculpture, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, and specifically how sculpture becomes a figure for the encounter.
I remember you telling me about this earlier today. Okay.
You go on to the next page.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. All right. So in this section of her paper, Joanna notes that in its classical conception, sculpture delivered a particular promise about the corporeal life, an ideal model wherein the body was matter, fully impregnated by spirit.
Slide.
Yes. So impregnated, in fact, that even the fragmented form of classical sculpture could still project this incarnated spirit. But the model of sculpture starts to fall apart in the 19th century for many reasons that we don't need to discuss here. Sculpture stops vouchsafing this relation of the psyche to form and instead threatens to become just one other object among many. And this, though it's part of the basic story of modern sculpture, is a tragedy for the surrealists because if what you're trying to do is reunite the psyche with the world, the loss of this promise is unfortunate indeed. So this is where the camera comes in as a prosthetic to this lost function of sculpture. Specifically, Joanna will soon tell us that it is the cinematic element of the close-up that retrieves the lost relation of psyche to form. The close-up is a kind of automatized close looking. It turns the act of focusing over to a machine, in this case, a camera. The Hungarian filmmaker and theorist Béla Balázs writes, "The close-up shows you your shadow on the wall, with which you have lived all your life and which you scarcely knew. It shows the speechless face and fate of the dumb objects that live with you in your room and whose fate is bound up with your own." The capacity of the camera to isolate objects and enlarge them makes it an analog of their very particular conjunction of distraction and focus that surrealists depend upon for their formulation of automatism and for their understanding of the found object. Can I just go to the next? Okay. After all, Balázs, in the quote that I just read aloud, does not choose to discuss a starlet's face or a pistol or a clock or anything else with a self-evident relationship to the operations of desire and narrative in a film. Instead, he mentions our shadow and our dumb possessions, objects that live alongside us and yet are distinct from us, and whose constant presence seems to secure their insignificance. That is, until the camera takes hold of them. If film is the distractor par excellence, the close-up is the channel where the speechless elements of our life suddenly make their way into view. The close-up produces enigmas, which is essentially the model of the encounter with the found object. This is why the close-up is also the motif that shows up when the Surrealists talk about making objects, often in the same terms they use to discuss finding them. In 1924, Louis Aragon writes an essay titled The Shadow of the Inventor, in which he muses on the little familiar objects in his life as, and I quote, pure imagination escaping from reason, a handkerchief, a match, a piece of string, some keys, objects which neither make us laugh nor cry, which scarcely occupy our eyes, but occupy our hands a little, and seem at first indifferent to our minds. So this, rather astonishingly, is how Aragon would like the inventors of tomorrow to conceive of their productions. I'm not sure what comes after this. I do realize now that you were supposed to be saying all of this. I'm really very sorry. I'm so sorry. Maybe you want to just, yeah. One moment.
All right, well, we can compare that statement to another essay Aragon wrote some years previously titled Du Décor, in which he writes about the tendency of children to maniacally focus their attention on an object to the point where their concentration makes it grow larger, so much that it completely occupies the visual field, assumes a metaphysical aspect, and loses all relation to its purpose. Or say they repeat a word over and over until it loses its meaning. We can see that this is modeled on the operation of the close-up, in which seemingly benign objects are invested with menacing or enigmatic meanings. The child can do this with just about everything. It's basically all the same to them, because they have so little experience with things in the world. But the Surrealists are only marginally interested in the psychic life of children, with the child's way of enchanting the world. They don't want enchantment, they want revolution. Specifically, the revolution that comes from annihilating the boundaries between psychic life and everyday action. And therefore, the objects that receive this intensification of expression must be precisely those everyday things that we barely notice and that are, for this very reason, bound up in our fate. The Surrealist artist Claude Cahun estimates that factory workers have a leg up on this new relation to objects because they are engaging constantly, repetitively, and mindlessly with things that have little to no function in their lives, and this primes them to appreciate the irrational value of objects, or the value of irrational objects.
Which is it?
That is the question. Both. One for each of the two senses of distraction that have been circulating in my, or in this, talk. First, distraction as an intensified demand on one's attention that pulls it away from the task or object at hand. This is distraction in the therapeutic practices of Janet and others, as well as in the close-up that it trained on the flotsam of life. And the second, distraction as a state in which we encounter and even produce objects, rolling a bus ticket in our hand while we wait in line, dropping a glob of toothpaste onto the counter as we think about the day ahead. These become unexpectedly substitutes for the lost promise of sculpture as incorporated spirit. Surrealism separates itself boldly from the practices that came before it and those that followed it by claiming distraction as a way of being with objects in the world, which is also a way of being with our forgotten pasts and with the fate of those objects that have accompanied us along the way. And thus, paradoxically, a programmatic application of inattention returns us to our world. Thank you. So now, let me hand the stage over again to Catherine. Catherine, as Graham introduced, comes to us from Tokyo by way of Beirut, and she is also interested in surrealist objects, as well as stylomancy, cryptesthesia, and sleepwalking. So this evening, she's going to talk to us about something called Leonardo's wall, which is a very important concept in surrealism. I'll let her tell you about this, of course, but let me just say that Catherine begins her talk, as she mentioned earlier, with a very provocative statement that surrealism can be defined as the programmatic misapplication of attention. So what does she mean by that exactly? Well, let me just say, to get us started, she shows that from the beginning, the surrealists deliberately paid attention to the wrong things, and they did it for a purpose. In categorically non-therapeutic settings, for example, they seriously discussed, notated, and published their dreams. People didn't really do that then, and they don't really do it today. They injected chance, blindness, and contingency into artistic production, and they treated the results like dredged-up pearls. They lingered over old, obsolete, useless objects and images and words, all the debris of time, all the things fallen out of history, and they lavished attentive and creative efforts on them. So, in fact, you could say, as Catherine does, that surrealist activity consists of two phases. First, to create or discover something meaningless. Second, to perceive or experience it as full of meaning. Or rather, to use various methods to force one's immediate physical environs and or mental ambiance too full of all too familiar meanings to yield up meaninglessness, and then to direct the arc lights of serious, intense attention upon it, such that forms begin to emerge from its formlessness. The methods varied greatly. There were the double-blind drawing and writing exercises they called exquisite corpses, the collages, the automatism, of course, or even, again, that special surrealist flânerie where you go in search of we know not what, and where marvelous things happen simply because of the intensity with which you expect them to. If you are a surrealist, you are powerfully drawn to all things that fall in the nimbus of being, things that aren't, but were, or almost were, or might be, or threaten to be, or fall just beneath the threshold of being. All the motes drifting at the margins of reality, all the phosphenes.
Yeah, phosphenes, that's when the eye perceives light in the absence of light. It's like a brief hallucination of light.
Interesting, okay, so, you know, could I also use just some of your slides here? I think they would help illustrate what I'm trying to say about your talk.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. All right, so, okay, well, they were drawn to all this because they wanted to make non-things into things. They wanted to add new things to reality. One way of doing this, as Catherine explains here, is to draw a kind of circle of attention around these non-things or non-entities, these chance arrangements of objects, marks, or words, these faint random scuffs on the surface of reality. To draw a circle around them, and then to bear down on them, to extravagantly and excessively attend to and upon them. What are these slides exactly?
They're some walls, some windows too.
So did you just take these?
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting, okay. And are all the slides like this?
Yep.
Okay, so the Surrealists wanted to make new things, but it's actually hard to do that because we in our imaginations are limited by what we already know and see around us. Sometimes we need a little help, and that's what the Surrealist practices of attention are for. That's why they can be called practices of creative attention. Now, Breton saw acts of surrealist attention as framing acts, creating fields of gratuitous and generous transformation of non-meaning into meaning, non-things into things. He called such frames écrans, screens or grids or even sieves. let's actually stop and take a look at what he said, because I can see that Catherine quotes some long passages here from Mad Love.
Yep.
Okay, so obviously, as you know, these passages have been very heavily read and interpreted, but just to state things simply, Breton is talking to us about a very special form of attention that can both register and generate objects and or events. So here in Mad Love, he writes, so you've got another slide cue here. Okay, it's another wall. Let me just read the quote aloud. Leonardo, inviting his students to copy their paintings from what they would see when they stared at an old wall for a period of time, is still far from being understood. The whole problem of the passage from subjectivity to objectivity is implicitly resolved there. Now, by this time in 1937, as I'm sure Catherine will explain to you, something called Leonardo's wall is fully established as a code phrase or shorthand, even a kind of shibboleth, among Surrealists and their sympathizers. It is actually no less than a whole theoretical edifice in miniature, trailing a complex series of associations. It's a microcosm of Surrealist concerns as they evolved by then, and also an entire approach to the visual perceptual image. Now, the furthest we can go back to trace the genealogy of this idea is Leonardo himself in his treatise on painting, compiled from the notes by one of his students around 1540 or so. In a note entitled, "A Way of Developing and Arousing the Mind to Various Inventions," Leonardo says, "When you look at a wall spotted with stains or with a mixture of stones, if you have to devise some scene, you may discover a resemblance to various landscapes, beautified with mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, plains, wide valleys, and hills in a varied arrangement. Or again, you may see battles, figures in action, or strange faces and costumes, and an endless variety of objects which you could reduce to complete and well-drawn forms. And these appear on such walls confusedly, like the sound of bells, in whose jangle you may find a name or a word you choose to imagine." In another place, the great man comments on Botticelli's idea of throwing a sponge impregnated with various colors at a wall that often leaves marks that look like a landscape. It's true, Leonardo adds, that a variety of compositions may be seen in such spots according to the disposition of mind with which they are considered. But he says that although those spots may furnish hints for compositions, they do not teach us how to finish any particular part. So what he seems to be saying about Botticelli's sponge throwing, and Catherine here comments that a lot of Surrealist activity can be seen as a kind of concentrated sponge throwing, is that one doesn't know how to finish or develop or otherwise remain in creative dialogue with these random patterns, these sponge spots, age spots, or macchia. One won't end up with much. So then there's some further discussion of passages on Leonardo's treatise. And Catherine then traces a genealogy moving from Da Vinci through Henri Bergson, Paul Valéry. I'm sorry, I'm just mindful of our time. Valéry's a huge influence on Breton. Okay. Catherine, how are you going to have time for all of this? Can I skip this part and just go on to the Valéry essay? Okay, I'm going to do this. The Valéry essay, it's titled Introduction to the Method of Leonardo da Vinci. And in Catherine's very careful reading of this essay, and here is her slide, Catherine shows that Valéry, the artist gaze, is simultaneously projective and receptive. Leonardo's students do not project already complete images upon a formless and very accommodating concatenation of spots and cracks. They also receive images. They receive what you could call the nuclei or seed crystals of images, images which they then project somewhat more solidly back upon the wall and so forth in a kind of feedback loop. Like the chicken and egg, it's impossible to say which side initiates. Catherine points out here that it is equally true that human perception or thought finds an image in the wall, and that the wall's form finds a potential thought or perception in the mind. Thus, she makes the point that for Surrealists, creative attention is also dialogic attention. This, I think, is important. Surrealist practices of creative attention are dialogic. And I should add, it's also important that Valéry thought about thought in a combinatorial way. like a kind of jumble of letters, a library, a Babel that could be combined to form any thinkable or unthinkable thought, if only we knew the trick. For Valerie, looking at Leonardo's wall-like surface is what can cause these thought atoms and thought letters to rejumble themselves and form new configurations, thoughts that haven't been thought before. So, oh, I love this quote. Okay, so Valerie writes in his Leonardo essay, "Anyone who is not seen in the whiteness of his paper and image, troubled by the possible and by regret for all the signs that haven't been chosen, or is not seen in the limpid air and edifice that is not there, does not know the richness and resources and domains of the spirit illumined by the conscious fact of construction." And then you have Breton, disciple of Valerie, in 1933, 5 years before Mad Love, commenting on this very passage, saying, "Tout est écrit, everything is written, everything, whether sentence or image, whether visible, half visible, invisible, is there somewhere in the whiteness, in the blank spaces, waiting to be read." On the elementary surfaces, he says, the world to come is trying to make itself visible. So now, in Catherine's talk, we finally return to Mad Love. I've actually skipped over a lot here. There's no way you could have done all this in the time. Except for, hold on, it looks like this part's just notes. I don't know. Well,
I didn't have a lot of time. I wrote this on the plane, actually.
It's totally fine. I know this stuff really well too, so I can just speak to it. All right. So what Breton is speaking about is the marvelous. How to draw it out, how to make it manifest, even set out traps or bait for it. How do you do that? Well, in short, you fiddle around, you move objects on a table, you open and close doors, you perform sequences of random acts, you open books, you doodle. But you have to be willing to be passive in a special, he calls it a durable, sustained way. Or rather, you have to practice a kind of active, focused passivity, a paradoxical state of being. So he writes, every life contains these homogeneous patterns of facts, whose surface is cracked or cloudy. Each person has only to stare at them fixedly in order to read his own future. Let him enter the whirlwind. That cracked wall is Leonardo's. And when you enter this whirlwind, reading the future is indistinguishable from bringing it about. The force that instigates, so this is too much, the force that indicates from the instrument that registers, active precipitation from passive acceptance, discovery from invention. Now, of course, because this is surrealism, all of this runs on the engine of desire. The patterns that lie virtually upon the blank page are latent in the dense network of cracks and spots, signs, marks, and forms, hidden in the forest of meaninglessness and the potentially meaningful. These need simultaneously to be discovered and invented. And desire is precisely the equal sign between these two. It is the plane of their simultaneity. Creative attention, and this, again, this is important, is desiring attention. Okay, what's this part at the end? There's a quote here. It does not follow that one of whom?
That's also from Mad Love. Actually, could I think I'm done here. So
Absolutely, I didn't mean to give your whole talk for you.
turnabout is fair play, right? Let's hold on just a second. So at first, Breton appears to be conceding in this passage that two people looking at Leonardo's wall with two different sets of desires will obviously see two different things. Yes, he says, but it does not follow, and this is him, it does not follow that one of them cannot rather easily have the other perceive what he sees in it. There seems to be no a priori reason for this primary illusion not to roam the world. So the wall, what he means is that the wall has cracks and spots, and those are like quilting points. anchored points of reference across all the possible artistic interpretations, all the possible visions. This is also true, for example, for the elements of waking life that are incorporated into a dream. So cats, ladders, cigars, doors, mothers, labyrinths, suitcases, airplanes, the creative, attentive vision of Leonardo's wall is like a dream that constructs, using the elements of existing reality, a new reality. And those stable points of reference are what allow this new reality to be shared with others, which is the crucial thing for Breton. And that is why Leonardo's wall can become what he calls a deep source of communication between beings. I tell you what I see in the wall, and then for you, it is a thing in the world. It is real. It's part of your world now. Now, here's a good Valéry quote from the part that you skipped. He writes that, "When we are made to see such images, our consciousness comes to suspect all accustomed reality of being only one solution amongst many others. It dares to consider its body and its world as almost arbitrary restrictions imposed on the range of its functions." So, in other words, Leonardo's wall uses the elements of our reality to suggest the possibility of an other reality, which, if we were all to hallucinate it at the same time, might become ours. You take some nameless thing drifting below the surface of collective consciousness, you make it the center of a collective practice, a collective act of attention. This makes it a thing. It literally makes it real. And then, of course, you have the option of making it more real, of watering it with further attention, and so on. And so creative attention is not just desiring attention, and not just dialogic attention, but it is also collective attention. And that is why the collective and programmatic misapplication of attention can change the world. That was the point. At least that's what I was going to say.
Then what were you going to do?
Well, I was gonna ask everyone here to give it a try. Maybe we could try with one of the slides here.
I had a feeling, but I have an idea.
What?
All right, we're gonna try this and do this quickly.
What are you gonna do?
I think that we use I don't know. Yeah? Okay.
You mean? Oh.
Yeah. This is how the sausage is made. Wait.
Is it gonna work?
All right.
That's so brilliant.
So, what we're going to try and do now is attempt altogether a surrealist practice of attention, or a practice of surrealist attention. So what we'll do is this. Actually, let's start here. We're gonna say two different exercises in silence together. Catherine and I will each, in turn, give you a series of mental directives. You can think of it like a guided meditation of sorts, in which we'll attempt from our seats to adopt a kind of surrealist comportment to things and images in the world. All right, this will be quite quick, but we'll give it a try. I'd like you, first all, if you would, please, to close your eyes. Imagine the blackness of an empty screen or the dark of a movie theater. Now please open your eyes. Look at the object before you. Imagine that you view it as in fact you do from afar. It is a thing among many. It's a scrap. Now bring your eye, just your eye, not your body, closer to it, as close as you can get. There are no objects, but this one, this particular object. Now this object, this unique object, is as unique as you. Imagine that it is a portrait of your insides.
So slowly, slowly bring yourself away from this object and begin looking at this image, looking at it closely, carefully, and with interest, but also with something like abandon. You have everything to say, and it has nothing to say. But then, and also, it has everything to tell you, and you are only there to listen. It is an answer to a question that is on the tip of your tongue. Every detail about it is meaningful and is part of that answer. Now, when you're ready, turn to your neighbor and just tell them a little bit about what you saw and see if you can see it together. Or, if you like, you may meditate upon it in silence. And when you feel you are finished talking or meditating, you may do as you wish, leave, stay with these encounters echoing in your mind.
Okay. Sit down.